Hashtag a pregnant widow begged the banker for bread, and he signed over the bank instead. The first tear fell as the church bell tolled 5. Clara Whitman sat beneath the old oak tree at the edge of town, one hand pressed against the rough bark, the other cradling her swollen belly. 6 months pregnant and 3 months a widow. The math of her tragedy was simple. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Oak Ridge's dusty main street. Clara watched as the bank's windows caught the golden light, gleaming like a taunt. Inside those walls lay the last remnants of her husband's dreams, soon to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. She felt the baby kick, a small flutter of life against her palm. Clara wiped her face and stood, brushing dirt from her faded dress. She couldn't afford tears. Not anymore. Oak Ridge had once been prosperous. Coal mines and timber had brought money and men to this corner of the territory. Now the mines were tapped out, the forests thinned, and the town seemed to shrink with each passing season. Storefronts stood empty, their windows collecting dust and dead flies. Only the bank remained solid, a 2-story brick building that dominated the town square like a fortress. Clara's cottage sat on the outskirts, a small place with a leaking roof and drafty windows. It had been her husband Thomas's first purchase when they married 5 years ago. Just temporary, he'd promised, until the investments pay off. Now it was all she had left. She walked slowly through town, feeling eyes on her from behind curtains. The widow Whitman. The gossip had started even before Thomas was cold in the ground. How he borrowed too much. How he'd made enemies of powerful men. How Clara would never manage on her own, especially not with a baby coming. Her daily route took her past the general store where credit was no longer extended, past the church where the pastor's wife had suggested the orphanage 2 towns over took in unfortunates, and finally to the small cemetery where Thomas lay under fresh dirt and a wooden marker. "I'm still here," she whispered to the grave. "We're still here." Back home, Clara lit a candle and counted her coins for the 3rd time that week. Not enough. Not nearly enough. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, as if protesting the tightness in her chest. The letter had arrived that morning. Official bank stationery, heavy paper with the Oak Ridge Savings and Loan letterhead embossed in gold. The auction notice listed everything. Thomas's mining stake, their wedding silver, even the pocket watch his father had given him. All to be sold in 7 days' time to satisfy his debts. Clara folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. There was one name at the bottom, written in a precise, slanting hand. Harold Finch, bank president. She'd seen Finch around town, a tall, thin man who moved like a shadow between the bank and his house on the hill. People said he'd come west after some scandal back east. That he kept to himself. That he showed no mercy to those who couldn't pay. Clara slept fitfully that night, dreaming of empty cradles and foreclosure notices. When dawn broke, she knew what she had to do. The bank opened at 9. Clara was waiting when Harold Finch arrived, his black suit immaculate despite the dusty street. He didn't notice her at first, focused on unlocking the heavy front door. When he turned and saw her standing there, something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, or irritation. "Mrs. Whitman." His voice was cool, professional. "The bank doesn't open for another half hour." "Mr. Finch." Clara straightened her shoulders. "I need to speak with you. About my husband's debts." He studied her for a moment, eyes moving briefly to her belly before returning to her face. "Very well. Come inside." The bank's interior was cool and dim, smelling of polished wood and paper. Finch led her through the main room with its teller windows and into a private office at the back. He gestured to a chair across from his desk, but remained standing himself. "I received your letter," Clara said. "About the auction." "Yes." Finch moved behind his desk, arranging papers without looking at her. "Standard procedure when accounts are significantly overdue." "I need more time." "Your husband's debts have already been carried longer than bank policy allows, Mrs. Whitman." Clara leaned forward. "I have nowhere else to go. No family. No prospects." Her voice caught. "Please. Just until after the baby comes." Finch finally looked at her directly. His eyes were gray, like river stones. "The bank is not a charity, Mrs. Whitman." "I'm not asking for charity." The words came out sharper than she intended. "I'm asking for mercy." Something changed in Finch's expression then, a subtle shift she couldn't quite read. He sat down slowly, folding his hands on the desk. "Your husband borrowed against collateral he did not possess. He made promises he could not keep." Finch's voice remained even, but there was a new tension in it. "The bank has obligations to its depositors. And I have obligations to my child." Clara pressed her hand to her belly. Thomas believed in those investments. He thought he was securing our future. Many men believe in fantasies, Mrs. Whitman. That doesn't make them real. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. My husband was not a fantasist. He was a dreamer, yes, but he worked harder than anyone in this town. The baby kicked again, as if in agreement. He believed in Oak Ridge when others were leaving. Finch's eyes narrowed slightly. I knew your husband, Mrs. Whitman, better than you might think. Before Clara could respond, the front door of the bank opened. Voices drifted in from the main room, the day's first customers arriving. Finch stood. I have business to attend to. The auction will proceed as scheduled. Clara remained seated. I'll come back tomorrow. That would be a waste of both our time. Nevertheless, she rose with as much dignity as she could muster. I'll be here. True to her word, Clara returned the next day, and the day after that. Each time, Finch received her with the same cool detachment, listened to her pleas with the same impassive expression, and dismissed her with the same finality. But something was happening. Small changes. On the third day, he offered her tea. On the fourth, he asked about her health. On the fifth, he showed her to a more comfortable chair when she winced while sitting. On the sixth day, the day before the auction, Clara arrived to find Finch standing outside the bank, apparently waiting for her. Walk with me, Mrs. Whitman, he said, not quite a request. Surprised, Clara fell into step beside him. They moved away from the main street, toward the edge of town where the old mining offices stood abandoned. Your persistence is remarkable, Finch said after they had walked in silence for several minutes. I have little choice. There are always choices. He stopped in front of a boarded-up building. This was the first bank in Oak Ridge. Did you know that? Before my time. It failed in the Panic of '73. Clara looked at the derelict structure. What happened? The owner extended too much credit to miners and loggers. When the markets crashed, he couldn't call in the loans. Finch's voice had softened slightly. He shot himself rather than face his depositors. That's terrible. It was business. Finch turned to face her. Your husband came to me 3 years ago with plans for a new mining venture. He believed there was a second vein that others had missed. Clara nodded. The eastern slope. He was certain of it. He was wrong. Finch's words were blunt but not unkind. The geological surveys were clear. There was nothing there worth digging for. But he kept going back. He said what he needed to believe. Finch cut her off. What he needed you to believe. Clara felt as if she'd been struck. Why are you telling me this now? Finch didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small key. There's something you should see. He led her back to the bank, but instead of entering through the front, he took her to a side door that opened onto a narrow staircase. They climbed to the second floor, where Finch unlocked a door to a small, dusty room. It was some kind of storage space filled with boxes and old furniture. Finch moved to a cabinet in the corner and unlocked it with a second key. Your husband's effects, he said, stepping back. What the bank collected after his death. Clara approached slowly. Inside the cabinet were Thomas's things, his ledgers, his maps, a stack of letters tied with twine. And something else, a leather portfolio she'd never seen before. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside were documents, deeds, contracts, letters of credit, all bearing Thomas's signature. And all, she realized with growing horror, representing debts far larger than she had imagined. He mortgaged everything, Finch said quietly. Not just your home and possessions. He borrowed against land he didn't own, against mineral rights that weren't his to sell. Clara's legs felt weak. She sank onto a nearby chair, the portfolio clutched in her hands. Why would he do this? Because he believed. Finch's voice held no judgment. Because men like your husband always believe the next claim will be the one that changes everything. Among the papers, Clara found a letter addressed to her, sealed but never sent. She broke the wax with her thumbnail and unfolded it. Thomas's handwriting stared back at her, as familiar as her own face. My dearest Clara. Asterisk if you're reading this, then I've failed you in the worst possible way. The mine has collapsed, not just the tunnels, but the financing as well. Finch knows everything. He's agreed to keep silent for now, but only because of our history. Asterisk. Asterisk you must know that everything I did for us. For our future. For the child we've dreamed of. Asterisk. Asterisk Finch is not the cold man he appears to be. Years ago, before I met you, he saved me from ruin once before. Ask him about Boston. Ask him about the fire. Asterisk. I love you more than life itself. Thomas. Clara looked up at Finch, who stood watching her with those stone-gray eyes. What does he mean about Boston? About a fire? Finch's face remained impassive, but something in his posture changed. That's a long story, Mrs. Whitman, and not relevant to your current situation. I think it is. Clara stood, one hand on her belly for support. I think my husband believed you would help me because of whatever happened between you. For the first time, Finch looked uncomfortable. Your husband misunderstood the nature of our arrangement. Then explain it to me. Finch turned away, moving to a small window that overlooked the town square. For a long moment, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, softer, tinged with an accent she hadn't noticed before. I knew Thomas in Boston before he came west. Before I came west, he worked for my father's shipping company. Finch's reflection in the window looked suddenly older. There was a fire at the warehouse. Workers trapped inside. Thomas went back in. Saved 3 men. That sounds like him, Clara whispered. One of those men was my younger brother. Finch turned back to face her. I owed Thomas a debt. When we both ended up in Oak Ridge years later, he called it in. Asked me to back his ventures. I did, against my better judgment. And now he's gone. And you're collecting. The bank is collecting, Mrs. Whitman. That's what banks do. Clara looked down at the letter in her hands, then at the cabinet full of her husband's broken dreams. He believed in you. Even at the end. Your husband was a good man who made bad decisions. Finch's voice hardened again. The auction will proceed tomorrow as planned. The day of the auction dawned clear and hot. Clara dressed carefully in her best dress, now tied across her middle. She pinned up her hair and wore the cameo brooch Thomas had given her on their first anniversary. The bank's main room had been cleared of furniture. Wooden chairs were arranged in rows, most already filled with townspeople when Clara arrived. Some came out of genuine need for the items being sold. Others, she knew, came for the spectacle. At the front of the room, Thomas's possessions were displayed on tables, his tools, his books, the silver tea service they'd received as a wedding gift. Clara kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at the pieces of her life laid out for strangers to paw through. Harold Finch stood at a small podium, looking as immaculate as ever in his black suit. If he noticed Clara enter, he gave no sign of it. Ladies and gentlemen, he began precisely at noon. Welcome to this auction of property held in lien by Oak Ridge Savings and Loan. All sales are final, payment due immediately in cash or bank draft. The auction proceeded efficiently. One by one, Thomas's possessions went to new owners, his mining equipment to the Petersons, his books to the schoolteacher, the tea service to Mrs. Abernathy, who couldn't quite meet Clara's eyes when she claimed it. Clara sat perfectly still, her face a mask. Inside, something was hardening, not just grief now, but anger. At Thomas for his deceptions. At Finch for his coldness. At herself for her blindness. When the last item had been sold, Finch cleared his throat. We now come to the matter of the Whitman property and associated mining claims. A murmur went through the crowd. This was what many had been waiting for, the real price. The opening bid is set at $800, representing the outstanding mortgage and associated fees. Silence fell. $800 was a substantial sum in Oak Ridge. 800, called a voice from the back. Clara turned to see James Wilson, owner of the largest remaining timber operation in the county. A man known for buying distressed properties and squeezing them for every penny. 850, countered another voice, Samuel Reed, the saloon owner. The bidding continued, climbing slowly. 900, 950, 1,000. Each number a hammer blow to Clara's heart. 1,200, Wilson called, and a hush fell over the room. It was an overwhelming sum, far more than the property was worth in the current market. Finch looked around the room. $1,200. Going once. Clara stood. Every head turned toward her. Mrs. Whitman, Finch acknowledged her with a slight nod. Do you wish to address the assembly? Clara walked slowly to the front of the room. She could feel the weight of every gaze, hear the whispers behind raised hands. Mr. Finch, she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. Before you conclude this auction, I would like to know about the fire in Boston. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. Finch's face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened where they gripped the podium. This is neither the time nor the place for personal matters, Mrs. Whitman. I disagree. Clara turned to face the crowd. My husband saved this man's brother from a burning building. Risked his life. And now, Mr. Finch repays that debt by selling our home while my husband lies cold in the ground and his child grows beneath my heart. The whispers grew louder. Finch's jaw tightened. The bank's obligations are clear, Mrs. Whitman. Your husband's debts must be settled. Yes, Clara agreed. Debts must be settled. All debts. She turned back to the crowd. My husband believed in this town when the mines failed. He invested everything we had, everything we were, in its future. He made mistakes, yes. He trusted unwisely. But he never stopped believing. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the child move within her. This baby will be born in Oak Ridge. Will grow up in Oak Ridge. Will learn that a person's worth isn't measured in dollars or deeds, but in how they face adversity. In how they honor their obligations, all of them, not just those written in ledgers. The room had gone completely silent. Even Wilson and Reed seemed uncomfortable now, looking anywhere but at the pregnant widow standing before them. Finch cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitman, while your situation is undoubtedly difficult. My situation, Clara interrupted, is the direct result of promises made and broken. By my husband, yes, but also by you, Mr. Finch. For the first time, Finch looked genuinely rattled. I made no promises to you, madam. Not to me. To Thomas. To the man who saved your brother's life. Clara stepped closer to the podium. You told me yesterday that there are always choices. Well, now you have one. Honor your debt to my husband, or complete this auction and show everyone in Oak Ridge exactly what kind of man you truly are. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Clara could hear her own heartbeat, feel the baby shifting restlessly within her. Finally, Finch spoke. This auction is suspended. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Everyone will receive their deposits back, Finch continued, his voice tight. The bank requires time to reassess the Whitman estate. The crowd erupted in confused chatter. Wilson protested loudly, but Finch silenced him with a raised hand. My decision is final. This assembly is dismissed. As the townspeople filed out, casting curious glances back at Clara and Finch, the banker gestured for her to follow him to his office. Once the door closed behind them, Finch seemed to deflate slightly, the rigid posture giving way to something more human. He sat heavily behind his desk. That was quite a performance, Mrs. Whitman. It wasn't a performance. Clara remained standing. Every word was true. Finch nodded slowly. Yes, I suppose it was. He opened a drawer and withdrew a thick folder. Your husband's complete file. Not just the debts, but the investments, the plans, the dreams. Some were foolish. Some were not without merit. He pushed the folder across the desk toward her. Take it. Perhaps you'll understand him better. Clara made no move to take it. What happens now? Now. Finch sighed. Now I have a problem. The bank cannot simply forgive debts of this magnitude. The board would never allow it. Yet it seems I have personal obligations that complicate matters. Then uncomplicate them. Finch looked up sharply. Meaning? Meaning there must be a solution that satisfies both the bank's needs and honors your debt to my husband. For the first time, something like respect flickered in Finch's eyes. You're proposing a business arrangement? I'm proposing we find a way forward that allows me to keep my home and you to keep your conscience. Finch leaned back in his chair, studying her with new interest. You're very much like him, you know. Thomas. The same stubborn optimism. I prefer to call it determination. A ghost of a smile touched Finch's lips. Very well, Mrs. Whitman. Let's determine our way forward. The next morning, Clara returned to the bank. The auction room had been restored to its normal function, with tellers behind their windows and customers conducting their business. Finch met her in his office, where 2 documents lay on his desk. I've considered our conversation, he said without preamble. And I see 2 possible paths. He pushed the first document toward her. Option 1. The bank extends a new mortgage on your property at favorable terms. You would have 5 years to repay, with the first year's interest forgiven. Clara skimmed the document. The terms were indeed generous, far more so than any normal bank would offer. And option 2? She asked. Finch hesitated, then pushed the second document forward. This is unconventional. Clara read it, then read it again, certain she had misunderstood. This is a transfer of ownership. Of the bank. Partial ownership, Finch corrected. 40% of Oak Ridge savings and loan, to be held in trust for your child until they reach majority. With you as trustee. Clara looked up, stunned. Why would you do this? Because banks require trust to function. The events of yesterday made it clear that my position in this community has been compromised. Finch's expression was unreadable. A local partner with a stake in Oak Ridge's future would restore confidence and satisfy your debt to Thomas. Yes. For the first time, Finch's voice softened. That too. Clara looked down at the 2 documents. The mortgage would be the safer choice, a clear path with defined obligations. The ownership stake was a gamble, tying her future to the bank's fortunes in ways she couldn't fully predict. What would Thomas do? The answer came immediately. He would take the risk. Always the risk. But she wasn't Thomas. If I choose the ownership stake, she said slowly, what would be expected of me? Initially, very little. You would recover from your delivery, establish your household. Later, you might take a more active role, reviewing loan applications, particularly from those seeking to develop local resources. Using Thomas's knowledge. Finch nodded. Your husband may have been overly optimistic about his own ventures, but he had genuine insight into the region's potential. Insight that could benefit others with more realistic expectations. Clara placed her hand on her belly, feeling the child shift beneath her palm. A boy or a girl who would grow up in Oak Ridge, not as the child of a failed dreamer, but as the heir to something substantial. Something built on Thomas's vision, even if not exactly as he had imagined it. I'll need time to consider, she said. Of course. Finch stood. The bank will take no action regarding your property until you've made your decision. Clara gathered the documents and left, walking slowly through the town square. The late morning sun was warm on her face as she made her way to the cemetery. Thomas's grave was as she had left it the day before, the simple wooden marker casting a short shadow on the fresh dirt. Clara sat on the small bench nearby, spreading the documents on her lap. Well, Thomas, she said softly, it seems you were right about Finch after all. She explained the two options, as if her husband could hear and advise her. The mortgage, safe, conservative, a clean break. The ownership stake, complicated, risky, a continued connection to the man Thomas had saved and trusted. You would take the risk, she said. You always did. A breeze stirred the leaves of the oak tree that shaded the cemetery. For a moment, Clara thought she felt Thomas's presence, not as a ghost or a spirit, but as the accumulated weight of their years together, the knowledge of who he had been and what he had wanted. But the choice was hers alone. 3 days later, Clara returned to the bank. Finch was at his desk, reviewing ledgers with his customary precision. He looked up as she entered, his expression giving nothing away. Mrs. Whitman, have you reached a decision? Clara placed both documents on his desk. On the ownership transfer, her signature stood bold and clear. I have. Finch studied the signed document, then looked up at her. Something had changed in his gray eyes, a new wariness, perhaps, or respect. You understand what this means? The responsibilities you're assuming. I understand that my child deserves more than charity or pity. Clara met his gaze steadily. They deserve a legacy, one built on their father's vision and my determination. Finch nodded slowly. Then we have an agreement. He offered his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Clara shook it. As their hands clasped, Clara felt the baby kick, a strong, decisive movement, as if signaling approval. I believe, Finch said quietly, that Thomas would be proud. Clara withdrew her hand. Thomas made his choices. Now I've made mine. She left the bank with her head high, feeling the weight of curious stares from customers and tellers alike. Word would spread quickly in a town like Oak Ridge. By nightfall, everyone would know that Clara Whitman now owned a substantial share of the bank. Some would call it charity from Finch. Others would invent more scandalous explanations. Few would guess the truth. A debt repaid, a legacy preserved, a future secured through an unlikely alliance. Clara walked to the old oak tree at the edge of town, where she had sat weeping just a week before. The late afternoon sun cast the same long shadows, but everything else had changed. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the life within her, a child who would be born not into desperation but into possibility. Your father was a dreamer, she whispered, but I'll teach you to be more. A builder. A creator. She looked back at the town, at the bank standing solid amid the fading businesses. And maybe, someday, a healer of broken things. The baby kicked again, stronger this time. Clara smiled and turned toward home, her shadow stretching behind her like a bridge between what had been and what might yet be. Total _char_count, 25,864.